with, and I worked with them. Question, out of the three kinds of bees, the orchard mason bee, the bumblebee, and the honeybee, one of them is not native. Do you know which one is not native? No. Yes. Yes, the honeybee is not native to North America. It was brought by the European settlers that came to North America. They came on the ships. I doubt they were on the Mayflower, but probably on the ones relatively shortly after that. If you remember pictures of old-fashioned skips, the straw beekeeping containers, somehow they put those on ships and brought them across the Atlantic. I'm not sure about the details, but it was done, and that's how the bee came here. And bees are perfectly capable of living in the wild and hollow trees and such, so that's how they spread. And even without the humans, they propagated all through North America. As for how I arranged the presentation, I went from kind of my beekeeper standpoint, I went from least time and work involvement to more. So we'll start with the bumblebee. The bumblebee is usually, it's kind of a build it and they may come kind of approach with the bumblebee house. As you can see, these bumblebees in this picture are living in a birdhouse, and that's one of their favorite places to set up home because bumblebee colonies like to have a little bit of insulation, a little bit of material, but they are not like birds. They don't carry material. They like it to be already there. And birds carry material to their nests and build nests in birdhouses, and so then afterwards the bumblebees like set up home and they'll go there. The other nests they traditionally like to set up home in are mouse nests, because again mice build, they live in the ground or in a little crevice and they make nice little cozy homes with whatever they can find. As in how a bumblebee colony.
You're in the right class.
As in how a bumblebee colony operates, it only lives for one, it's not even 1 year, it's usually a couple of seasons, like one part of 1 year. So it starts with a queen bumblebee who was created last fall, and she overwintered in a hole in the ground or in a crack or crevice somewhere, and as the temperature warms up, she comes out. There are all kinds of different bumblebee varieties in North America, like dozens of them, and they all have different color combinations. Like you can see on this one, they have like orange bottoms, some are more yellow, some have yellow and orange, more black, less black, and so depending on the variety, they oftentimes come out at different times of the year, like they need various temperatures to become active. And you might have seen bumblebee queens around because they are the big, hairy, colorful bees that will be flying low on the ground looking for little crevices and holes because they want to set up home. And you can build a home. It can just be a wooden box. My husband built me some of these, and we put a plexiglass lid on it so we can put it by a window and watch it. And then we gave them some cotton upholsterer's wool for bedding. And we have had bees move in, but it's not a given. Right now I don't even have one out because I just have this one that I use for my little show and tell in it. There's a little hole in the front where they can come in. And so you can, but again, if you just have a birdhouse, and if you don't want bumblebees moving into your birdhouse, make sure you clean out your birdhouses at the end of the season. That's all it takes, because if it's just an empty birdhouse with nothing in it, they won't move into it. In a bumblebee colony, you have three kinds of bees. You have the queen bumblebee, which we talked about, is the one that emerges in the spring, and she finds that abandoned birdhouse with some nesting material in it, and she sets up shop. And she can create wax. You've heard of beeswax, which is commercially sold, which is always made by honeybees. But bumblebees can make wax. They make little, their nests are much less organized than a honeybee's. They make these little round pots, and like in these pots, you see some liquid, they actually collect nectar and bring it back and store it. So when the queen, see there's our queen bumblebee. She's way bigger than the worker bees. So in the spring, when our queen bumblebee has found that abandoned bird nest, and she's made a couple of these cups, one to store honey in, and the other one to lay some eggs in. She will then kind of hover over the nest. She can disengage her wing muscles, and she can shiver the muscles, and she create warmth, and that'll keep the eggs warm, and they'll hatch, and there'll be larvae, which is kind of like maggots or grubs, same thing. And she flies out and collects nectar and pollen to feed them, and she does that for the first group of probably 5 or 6 workers. She does that all on her own. And once they've been fed and they've reached their maximum larvae size, she covers up the top of the cup, and inside the larvae will metamorphose into a bumblebee. So from looking like a white grub, it'll turn into a bumblebee and then chew its way out and hatch. And the bumblebees will look like, as you can see, they look like mini-me's of the queen bumblebee. And then those first bees that hatch, they will all be females, and they will all be worker bumblebees, and they will go out and they will do some of the nectar and pollen collecting to feed the next generation, because the queen bumblebee is the only fully functioning bumblebee in the nest that can lay fertilized eggs, and so she will stay in the nest and do that more and more and fly out less, and her mini-me's, her workers, will fly out. And as the resources become more plentiful, the future generations of workers will actually get a little bigger. So the first ones, like now when you see bumblebees flying around, they sometimes look really small. And then later in the season, you can see the same species of bumblebee a little bigger, because they have better nourishment, better nutrition while they're developing, and they actually get a little bigger, which is different from like the honeybee, which is pretty much always the same size. I have a bumblebee here. It's a dead bumblebee, so you can look at it. Bumblebees are also the fuzziest of the bees that we talk about, and that fuzziness helps them to keep warm and to fly out at a little cooler temperature. Bumblebees are very good for pollination for certain plants. They're really well adapted to tomatoes, because bumblebees are one of the species that's native to North America, and a plant that's native to North America is the tomato. Well, not North America, but the Americas is the tomato. And when the tomato flower blooms and a bumblebee visits it and buzzes its wings, the tomato flower, in response to that frequency of buzz, will actually release its pollen. So bumblebees are now commercially bred for that purpose, because we eat so many tomatoes that are pretty much mostly grown in greenhouses, that there are companies that breed bumblebees and make them available to greenhouse operators. You can try the whole pollen release by using an electric toothbrush and touching a tomato flower, and you can actually see the little puff of pollen come off it. But it's not very efficient to have people go through greenhouses with electric toothbrushes, so it's much better for that. They found a way to use bumblebees. Honeybees wouldn't be a great choice for greenhouses, because honeybee colonies are way bigger. They are tens of thousands of bees, and that would be too much. And again, they're not as efficient in the pollination of tomatoes, especially. And so bumblebee colonies will only have, at most, maybe 50 to 200 bees at the maximum. I mean, bumblebee colonies never get very large. And as the season progresses, the bumblebee queen will lay unfertilized eggs, which will turn into male bumblebees, which will go out and find virgin queens, because the queen will also raise certain eggs into virgin queens. That's usually, there's more nutrition, better nutrition involved in the raising of queens. And so these virgin queens and the drones, or the male bees, bumblebees, will go out and hopefully find each other, or find actually drones from another colony to mate with. And at the end of the season, by September, October, everyone in the bumblebee nest, besides the newly mated bumblebee queen, will die. The old queen, like this queen, she will die at the end of the season. They only live through one, like spring, summer season. And that's, I'm assuming the dead bumblebee that I have, it probably was just a bee that was done with its life. Most of these insects only live about 6 to 8 weeks, except for the queens. The queens, like the queen will, hatch in the fall, will mate, will overwinter in like a pile of debris or in a hole in the ground, a little mouse hole again or something. And then she will live to the next spring, to the end of the next season. So the queens live the longest, but the workers only live about 6 to 8 weeks. They literally work themselves to death. They just collect pollen, collect nectar, and just work. If you guys have any questions, feel free to interrupt me at any time. I'm happy to. Anyone? Yes?
So if a queen bee dies, like when she goes out collecting stuff for the first generation,
That's
what
it.
happens to
That's
them?
it.
Okay, so
Game over. Yep, that's why the colony will try to put more than, several young queens out at the end of the season to kind of have a chance to, or at least maybe one to mate. Yes.
So how, at the end of the season, how many virgin queens does she have eggs?
I don't know exactly. Again, bumblebees they're not studied as well as honeybees. Honeybees are the most studied bees because they are of such financial importance to the agriculture industry. So bumblebees are just getting there because they've discovered that they are very useful in greenhouses. But I don't know how many virgin queens they make. I don't know.
Do you collect humble or
Bumblebee.
bumblebee honey?
No, I don't think they make honey. I think they just, they make the little pots and they keep nectar in them. Nectar is mostly water. Honey is nectar that has been reduced down to about 15% moisture content. So these guys just store some nectar. Because they don't live over the winter, honey is really the honeybee's way to be able to survive the winter when there are no flowers blooming and no food available. And so the bumblebee never, as a colony, never lives through a winter and doesn't need food in the winter, so they've never figured out how to make honey. They just have a little bit of nectar stored, because especially in the early days, in April and even in May, we can have a couple of rainy days, cool days, where the queen or the workers might not be able to go out, and in order to keep those larvae fed that they just have little bits of resources to get them through a rainy day. Yes?
Can you repeat the seasons for like when the female or the queen bee lays eggs for the male and females?
Or when there's both around?
Like when you said like how queen bees will lay eggs for like the females first.
Mostly female, yeah, and then later in the season. So that gets us a little bit into the genetics. Bees have, worker bees and queen bees have 2 X chromosomes. Male bees only have 1 X. They're basically like little flying packages of sperm. Each male bee is just a little flying package of sperm. And the queen bees can mate with multiple males, and they have a special organ in their body called a spermatheca, where they can gather and collect and keep that sperm. And then when they lay eggs, they can decide if an egg is going to be fertilized. It'll get an X from the female and an X from the male. It'll be an XX. If the egg is going to turn into a male bee, she lays an unfertilized egg, which will just be an X, which is called a haploid, which means just
They don't have one.
hmm?
They don't have one.
Okay, perfect. So a male bee is a haploid. It only has half a set of chromosomes. So just, yeah, it's this little flying package of sperm.
Do you guys remember what another term for a haploid individual? And from plants? Gametophytes, yeah. So basically the males are flying, they gametozoa because they're animals, but they're basically like flying gametophytes.
Yeah, and the queen can decide if she's going to fertilize an egg or not. And the details of that, I think, are still a little foggy for science. As far as I know, I haven't read any great enlightening. So there's room for research here. So that's the bumblebee. They're really cool. They're not very aggressive. I mean, usually if you see bumblebees, you know, they're just doing their thing. Of course, if you're digging in the yard and you get into their nest, they will be defensive and they can sting. So I mean, don't grab them, don't hold them, but they're really cool and they do a great pollination job, especially if you want to grow tomatoes and everything like that. They do a great job. Yes.
So are their colonies fairly small?
Yes, they maybe 50 to 200 bees max at the peak of the season, which is hardly anything. And like I said, each individual worker bee only lives about 6 to 8 weeks, and works. Then our next bee is the orchard mason bee, which is a solitary bee. So it doesn't work together, it doesn't form a colony, it just does its own thing. It is gregarious, so it doesn't mind living near others, but each one does its own thing. They are around, they're native to our area. There's, I think there are other mason bees. We're most familiar with the orchard mason bee because people have figured out that it's pretty easy to propagate, it's easy to deal with the cocoons, and so they've kind of been the hip bee. I don't know if you go to any nurseries, there's a lot of orchard mason bee paraphernalia for sale. When you start out in orchard mason bees, you can either hope that they are in your neighborhood and you can just put out a little house, or you can put out the house and buy cocoons from a nursery, or I have a friend that has them. With orchard mason bees, we only have two kinds of bees. We only have males and females. None of this queen drone worker thing. Just male and female. When you look at the picture of the male versus the female, can you see one feature on its body that could maybe help you keep them apart? Male versus female? Look at the head.
The antenna.
The antennae, yeah. The male has longer antennae. And the female is oftentimes bigger, but I actually have some dead orchard mason bees in a little jar, and you can look and you can see there's quite a bit of size variation. If you look carefully, there's actually one in there that is obviously a male because it still has at least one long antennae left. Maybe by the time it gets to the back of the room, it might not anymore. And these died in my house because when they hatch and they fly around, sometimes they get into my house and they get on a window like a fly does, and then I don't always see them, and so then I collected them. So I didn't kill them, but so with orchard mason bees, the houses that you can get for them, the most simple one is this, which I'm not a big proponent of because when they are living so close together, they get a lot of pollen mites. And I've seen when I first had them in these kind of nesting box setups, they wouldn't come back, they wouldn't survive as well. And I think it was due to pollen mites. And after reading more about it, pollen mites are these tiny mites that live, as the name says, in pollen and eat pollen. And they use the bees as fairies to get them from flower to flower, but over the winter, because there's pollen in these nesting boxes, we'll get to why, when the bees emerge, they can be covered in pollen, and so that's why I clean my cocoons now to get rid of them. So let's say you built a house. I like the modular house, which looks like this. When you take it apart, it looks like this. When it's together, it just looks like this, and you put your cocoons out, and here's the cocoons, and the bees will chew their way out of the cocoons. All of these have hatched, so they all have a hole. You're welcome to take it out and touch it, and if it squishes, it's no big deal. So you set out your house, you set out your cocoons, and the males will hatch first. They will go find a flower, have a drink of pollen, and then they'll go back to where they hatched, and they'll wait for the females to emerge. The females need another couple of days more of warmer weather, and then the females will hatch. They will mate with each other, and then the females will start their work, which is making sure the next generation happens, and they will collect pollen, and they will bring it back to these holes, and they starting in the back of here. Yes. No, they don't mate with each other, they mate with the males. will kind of hang around, because they know that there'll be more action. So then they start in the back, and the females will collect the pollen, and you can see them coming back to your little house covered in pollen, and they'll groom the pollen off themselves, and they make a little pile of pollen in the back of this groove, and then when the pile has reached the desired size, the female will lay one egg on that pile of pollen, and then they make a little mud wall, and I'll show you next. See the little mud walls? So they make little compartments, and these are all little mud walls in between the eggs. So they will then go into your yard, and they'll find dirt, and they will carry that in their mouth parts. They will carry that back to their little nest, and they make a little mud wall, and then they do the same over and over, and that's how we get these cocoons. That's the cocoons that are going through. They lay in these grooves, and the female bee can. Again, she can decide if it's going to be a fertilized or unfertilized egg, and she puts the fertilized eggs in the back here, which is where the females will be, because remember the females hatch later, and so in the front she'll have the males. It's also, in the bee world, the females are usually the more important, more critical sex, so if a woodpecker were to find this, chances are that he would get to the male larvae or cocoons first and eat those, and hopefully, a few of those would survive, and the females in the back would survive as well. And, yes?
How would, if one hatched from the back, like before it, how's it gonna get out?
They chew their way through.
Even if
Females
the
around
other
the back.
one's still-
Yep, even if there's a dead one, you can see some of these, there's like
And then
some
male
things
front.
didn't necessarily, well, sometimes it's just because of it, but sometimes you have cells that, things happen, things didn't work out. And if you weren't to clean it out, if it was just the old fashioned kind of thing, I mean, in nature, they just crawl over, I mean, they will make their way out. So these bees start to become active, to hatch out of their little cocoons. It can vary. It can be the last week of February, or it can be as late as the middle of March that they start. It really depends on what our weather does, what the temperature is. And they usually hatch right around the time that our apple trees and pear trees and plum trees are blooming. And these fly at a little lower temperature than honeybees as well. And they're supposedly very, very effective pollinators. Because, the flower puts out nectar kind of as a lure for bees, but really the flower is all about pollination, about getting this pollen moved from one flower to the other to be pollinated, to make a seed, to make a fruit, to propagate. And so that's what the bee is all about. So then I take these out in the fall, and I take them apart, and I actually wash the cocoons, because the pollen mites will be all around the outside of the cocoon, and then I put them in the refrigerator, in my vegetable drawer in the refrigerator, and then I take them out in the spring. But you don't have to, I mean, you can leave them. I prefer to leave them all nights. Yes?
So do these kind of bees actually find something close to this kind of structured thing?
Yes, they don't travel very far. These orchard mason bees, they only travel about 300 yards, I've been told. They stay very close to where where you release them and where they are. That's another reason my backyard gardeners like them, because they stay close. And you can see, I see them in my Asian pear apple tree all the time. They stay close. Now to Alaskan bee, which has the honeybee, which has the most complex kind of setup. The honeybee lives in hives like this. I brought you you can see it's like modular living kind of. So each hive is made up of these boxes. Each hive has this bottom part that provides them an entrance, and then a lid that keeps the elements out. And inside are these, which are called frames, that the bees live on. And in the honeybee hive, we go back to the three kinds of bees. We have one queen. So each one of these tall stacks has one queen bee. She's the only fully functioning female. She's the only one that can lay fertilized eggs. Then we have thousands and tens of thousands of workers that do all the grunt work. They take care of the larvae, they bring in the nectar and the pollen, they guard the hive, they clean the hive, they do all the work, and then we have the drones, who are the male bees who take the genetic material of the hive and hope to find virgin queen bees to mate with to further the dominance of that gene. Out of the three kinds of honeybees, or bees in the honeybee hive, the queen bee and the worker bee have stingers. The drone has no stinger. You probably have never seen a drone bee because they don't work. They don't visit flowers because that would be work, collecting pollen and nectar. They hang out in the hive. They are always on the frames that have honey and pollen on them because they like to eat. And on nice sunny afternoons, they fly out to these areas that somehow each drone knows where they are. They're called drone congregation areas. They're up high in the air, and they're kind of the sports bar for bees. They hang out there, and the virgin queen bees also know where these areas are, and they also fly there, and then that's where bees mate. Bees mate in flight. Queen bees mate with 10 to 15 drones, and mating is a once-in-a-lifetime experience for drones. If it does get lucky and it finds a virgin queen, it basically kind of rips its hind end apart in plastic.
So they die after they.
And so when you were to start beekeeping, you purchase your equipment, your boxes and stuff, and you buy bees, and usually you buy about 3 to 4 pounds of bees and 1 queen bee, because the hive, the honeybee hive is so structured and so well organized, they really need that number of workers to make things happen, because they keep the temperature inside a beehive is kept at about 80, 85, 88 degrees year round. So I told you how the bumblebee can disengage its wings and shiver its body and keep things warm, but because they're never as big a colony as the honeybee, the temperature always fluctuates. The honeybee has a little internal thermostat that makes it keep things warm at that temperature, that mid 80 degrees. And you have, 20, 30, 40,000 bees do that. They can keep the temperature very exact. So that's why when you have the development of the honeybee, it is very set. A queen takes 16 days to develop, a worker takes 21, and a drone takes 24, because it's this controlled environment. With a bumblebee, if they did that, I'm sure, it would be very even and very exact as well, but they don't. But the honeybee keeps things regulated, and that way you know exactly how long it'll take. And here you see at the bottom of the cell, the queen will lay an egg, and then it turns into a larvae grub maggot. It's all, they look all the same. They're these little white things, and they get fed by the worker bee. Remember, the worker bees do all the work, so the worker bees feed the larvae, and the larvae gets fed 20 to 30 plus times a day. It's just the workers are just always feeding them nectar and pollen. And the reason bees are interested in pollen is really for the larvae. The adult bee itself mostly eats nectar. It needs sugar because it's flying, it's working. But the larvae needs to grow and develop, so it needs the protein, and that's what the pollen is there for. And so that's why bees collect pollen, is in order to feed their young. And after the larvae, it goes through instars. It sheds its skin, because just like a caterpillar, in order to grow, it has to get a new skin to get bigger. And so that's what the larvae does in this cell. And after, I think it's 7 instars, after several instars, the worker bees know that the larvae has reached its maximum size, and they then cover the cell with a wax capping. The bees build everything in the hive, all the famous honeycomb structure. It is all built from wax that the bees produce in the glands in their abdomen, and it comes out. Bees are insects, so they have this exoskeleton, this armor-like skin, and it's in segments, so the bee can move, and between these segments, the tiny little pieces of wax come out that the bees take and then with their mouth parts fuse together and work into the honeycomb. And inside my my hives, I use it's called frames, and I put either this in a frame that has kind of a pre-printed honeycomb on it to help them, which they really don't need the help, but it just makes it a little easier, it directs them. Or I can give them a frame like this, and they make it look like this. This started out as this, and then the bees build all the wax in here. And as you saw in the other picture, you can see the drone is physically bigger than the worker. And when they raise drones, I'll let this go through, they actually make the honeycomb bigger to accommodate the bigger size of the drone. And this other one is the size to raise worker bees. And honey can be stored in either one. So this honeycomb that they build is really totally multi-purpose. It can be used to raise their young, it can be used to store honey, it can be used to store pollen. They use it for everything, so you're welcome to let that go through. And when they feed the larvae, so they select nectar and pollen, there's another substance that bees make that it is commercially used as well. It has all kinds of supposed miracle properties. Do you know what other substance the bees make to feed their young? Any guesses? It's called royal jelly. It is a white substance that is made in glands in their head, and that is their food for their young. And that's all larvae are fed that for the first 3 days of their life.
Wait a second, royal jelly,
Royal jelly.
not propolis?
No, propolis is just used for like cinching, like
Okay.
yeah, no,
Royal
royal
jelly,
jelly.
they usually give it to all
For the first 3 days, everyone gets it.
of them. Okay.
And then after 3 days, workers and drones are put on a diet of more pollen and nectar.
Okay.
The queen, if a queen bee is raised, it is fed exclusively royal jelly. And that's why a queen bee has these fully functioning ovaries and has this longer life than your worker bee. And I think that's what people have kind of taken and run with, and that's why it's being marketed. I don't know if
It's like a
that's.
skin cream, right?
Yes, it's in skin cream. I mean, you can even buy little preparations, like little bottles that supposedly have royal jelly in them. It's usually, most of it is produced in much warmer climates where they can raise queens all year, because in order to harvest it, you have to destroy queen larvae like all day long to get this royal jelly. So it's an interesting process. But yeah, that's another substance. So bees can make wax that comes out of glands in their abdomen, and they can make royal jelly, which is this white, it is almost like a creamy substance that they make in glands in their heads and that they feed their larvae. Substance. And so let's assume you